Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the Spring 2026 Our Narrative Showcase. My name is Allison McGurdy, one of the co-directors of Diversity and Engagement at the Institute of Politics. Since the inception of Our Narratives in 2022, undergraduates have been given the opportunity to share their stories of adversity and advocacy. This semester, we have 6 incredible speakers from the classes of 2029 and 2028 sharing their stories of finding their voice and motivation to go into public policy. And with that, we'd like to introduce our first speaker, Cole Butcher, from the class of 2028, with his speech titled, Meth, Poverty, and Power, an Appalachian Story.
I've lived it. Through the sounds of small explosions, the sights of burn marks on my kitchen cabinets, and the repugnant smell of a fresh batch of meth. While my peers learned their fundamental math skills at the kitchen table with their parents, I learned mine by calculating the prices of the substances my mother was selling. Whether it was assisting in distributing her newest product, jumping out the window to hide from the police raiding our home, or going from gas station to gas station, trying to find one that was oblivious enough to accept our fraudulent check. I was her partner in crime, quite literally. Through the chaos of my childhood, we didn't have much to rely on. The only thing that we did have was the welfare checks that we could count on, the first of every month. Just 3 months before graduating nursing school, my mother received her first conviction after an altercation with a family member. She never held employment again. Instead, she turned to a life on the streets. In eastern Kentucky, where wages were low and poverty was high and addiction was everywhere, meth sales and welfare fraud allowed her to get by and support me and my sister better than working somewhere local for $7.25 an hour. But while she went down that path, me and my sister, we relied on EBT, Medicaid, and free school lunch simply to live. At 11 years old, my mother was sentenced to an extended prison term for her drug crimes. So, me and my sister went to live with our grandmother full time. She had been the housewife to an abusive husband from the age of 15 until nearly 40. She had never had the ability to work or pay into retirement. So, she raised me and my sister on a $700 monthly disability check and EBT. I remember sitting in the recliner of her single-wide trailer, watching debates happening over food stamps on Fox News. Conservative commentators were describing families like mine as lazy, deadweight scammers. They advocated for people like my family, to lose food stamp eligibility. When they were saying that, what stuck out to me was they were not just talking about my mother. They were talking about my sister and about me. I was only a child at the time, but I understood I could not lose the one thing that was feeding us every single month, because people had decided that families like mine were disposable. It was a struggle to survive. And in eastern Kentucky, that struggle wasn't unusual. Nestled in the heart of central Appalachia, our region was one where poverty was inherited, where most households relied on public assistance, where 60% of students lived with their grandparents due to addiction, and were the households that were most reliant on welfare programs were surrounded by rhetoric telling them that they were the issue. And yet, Appalachia is home. The mountains of eastern Kentucky are beautiful. They're quiet. They're steady. They're full of incredible perseverance and hope. For generations, Cole gave families in these mountains a way to build a life. But as that industry declined, that stability kind of faded with it. Jobs never came back, and coal companies took every single penny with them. But opioid companies and an addiction complex came to fill the gap. They came to fill the gap. Families kept going, doing what they could to get by, even as the ground beneath them was shifting. We relied on one another, our family, and our community. And every night, I would remember my grandmother turning on Sean Hannity and hearing a parody of that same old message again, that families like ours were the problem. I never understood how she didn't hear the hatred for our family and our community in that. But I did. And that hatred, it gave me the drive to change the narrative and use policy for good. So, starting at the age of 12, I organized 150 beds to be given out to the nearly 15% of students in my district who were sleeping on wooden pallets and floors. That next year, I worked on my first piece of legislation, Senate Bill 218, to address youth vaping in Kentucky. And at the age of 15, I was in the Kentucky State Capitol, speaking with bill drafters and drafting House Bill 44, which granted mental health days to students in Kentucky. I testified in state, House, and Senate committees, coordinated with media and the legislators to secure support, and after a months-long effort, it passed near unanimously and was signed into law by our governor. It was a moment of profound pride, but also a sense of what was possible. Before I knew it, I was leading the Democratic governor's re-election campaign in the Eastern Kentucky region, knocking on hundreds of doors, coordinating volunteers, and fighting for that investment that my community so desperately deserved. My work culminated in 2024 when I became the first person from my county to be accepted into an Ivy League institution. For me, it was all a response to a childhood where policy wasn't something that stayed in Washington or on paper. It determined if I ate that day, the lights were going to stay on that month, and if I was going to go to the doctor the next time that I was sick. And through it all, the hardest part of growing up, like I did, was hearing people talk about families like mine as if we didn't care, as if we weren't trying, as if we were the problem. But we weren't. We were just trying to get by in a place where the ground beneath us had already shifted. And children like me, get caught in the middle of that. They didn't choose or cause any of that hardship, but they have to suffer through every bit of it. And I'm standing here today because somebody, at some point, decided that children like me were worth investing in, that they were worth feeding and worth believing in. And that's what we need to remember. I don't want to go into policy to make another headline, but because those decisions that were made in Capitol halls that were far, far away were the decisions that determined if I was going to make it out of the cycle of poverty or be given a fighting chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Cole, for that beautiful speech on addiction, stigma, and legislative power. Next up is Jana Sophia Escalar Hupp from the class of 2029, sharing her story, What We Owe to the Lives We Don't Live.
At my first rally, I held a sign, trembling in my hands. Standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, I grappled with a question that had followed me since childhood. What does it mean to deserve what you have? I was born in the Philippines to two 20-somethings eyes wide entering the big city of Cebu for law school. They came from farming families and grew up near rice paddies and cornfields. And when I was a kid, they were just at the beginning of their careers, meaning that supplies were scarce. And so the affidavits and court transcripts my parents brought home became the paper of my childhood. My origami, my drawings, and even my schoolwork. I did it on these documents. And one day, I found myself more interested in reading them than doodling on them. Unlike the tragedies I saw in books and movies, I understood that the stories in these pages were real. Real names, real Filipinos, real people who lived not far off from where I did. And although I realized that Jeff Bezos' kid would probably gag at the idea of having to live my life and just see lack, I was, in many, many ways, lucky. Mine was a small house, but I always had a roof above my head. I never had to choose between food and my education, or shoes and electricity. And it is so hard to live as if it were effort or merit, and not some random lottery that put me into this life instead of theirs. Knowing that, it becomes really difficult to stay still. So I didn't. With this rude awakening came a sort of adrenaline rush. My life became child welfare centers, community pantries, and human rights seminars. I started volunteering a lot. Eventually, our National Labor Center adopted me. And whatever free time I had, I spent holding EDs, what we called our political educational discussions, or organizing factory workers, and just taking to the streets, protesting, rallying. And a lot of the firsts in my life came from this kind of activism. My first flight alone, my first time holding a megaphone, my first time sneaking out at night. And my first time seeing someone die. In the Philippines, the moment you start organizing, speaking up, being visible, you are no longer just a student or a volunteer. You become something to monitor. We have a term for it in my country. We call it red tagging. It's when activists are labeled by authorities as members or supporters of communist rebel groups. And once you have that label on you, it doesn't really matter how you see yourself anymore. The line between activist and terrorist is no longer yours to draw. And the things we were fighting for, these weren't even particularly controversial asks. They were things like, don't let this company cover up an entire river. Release this innocent journalist from jail. Let women get divorced. Fun fact, there are only 2 countries in the world where divorce is still illegal. One is the Vatican, and the other is the Philippines. But even calling for these fundamental human rights can be fatal. At the age of 16, I found out that my name, my social media, and my pictures had been logged on to our national police database. I had been red tagged. And at the time, I remember feeling so proud and almost giddy. It felt like I had joined a secret league of the true activists. I had made it. I had been recognized. But really, I was just very, very lucky that I was young, that I was small, that there are much bigger targets than a 16-year-old girl. Because for others, some I knew, that label doesn't just sit in a database. It follows them, it escalates, and sometimes, well, frequently, it ends them. All that to say, when I got into Harvard, the adults in my life did not break out into cheers. Instead, they breathed sighs of relief. Their troublemaking girl could no longer take to the streets and risk her life for youthful idealism. But isn't it very ironic that my labor activism in the Philippines opened up the doors for me to go to Harvard? But in doing so, it requires me to leave it. And while my comrades are back home fighting their fight, I'm here, fighting PSETs and Mather haters. And Harvard's current tension with labor and campus unions just kind of adds to that irony. I owe an impossible amount to this place, and every day I wake up with this sense that the trajectory of my life has shifted significantly just by me being in Harvard, which makes it really uncomfortable to say that it is not always in the right. Sometimes I think about whether I even deserve to be here. And don't get me wrong, it is such an honor to be able to stand in front of amazing people like you and tell my story. But I can't help but think of Nyla, this young girl who once told me that her greatest wish for the next life was not to be some celebrity or billionaire, but a hotel receptionist. Because even that was unfathomable for her. I think of Baby River, 3 months old, who died when her mother, 23-year-old activist Reina Nacino, was detained. Just 2 days ago, RJ and Alisa, who was my age, along with 17 others, were murdered in an island right next to mine by the military and slandered even after their death as terrorists. I think about even my parents, who are much more brilliant than I am, but who at the age of 21 had to stop living for their own dreams so that my siblings and I could have ours. And it's my story that's being told. It puts everything into perspective very quickly. How little my life is in comparison to the lives others are forced to live. Everything this place affords me, the distance, the safety, the possibility, was built on the fact that I was allowed to leave when others were not. And there's really only 2 ways that this story could end. Either I stay and I learn to live with that, or I go back and I refuse to let their stories die. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana, for that eye-opening speech on the price of activism, representing the stories of those who can't see it in themselves. It was truly impactful. Now we welcome Maritz Acosta from the class of 2029 with a speech titled, "The Responsibility We Share."
"11 years ago, I boarded a flight that changed my life. I don't remember every moment, but I remember the feeling of leaving behind what was familiar and stepping into what was uncertain. My parents made the decision to move to Miami, to the United States, a country that represented so much for Cuban families like ours: opportunity, a voice, freedom. I didn't fully understand what that meant then, but I've spent the years since trying to. I was born in the Netherlands, the son of Cuban immigrants who carried with them the stories of a nation they had left behind, stories of limitations, stories of a system where opportunities are not defined by effort, but by the limits imposed on you. All 4 of my grandparents were born in Cuba. 2 of them still live on the island nation and will for the rest of their lives. Every time I visited them and I saw my cousin Marai, who is just 1 year older than me, I was reminded by how the places we live in shape the trajectories of our lives. Marai was raised by the same extended family with many of the same values. The only difference is that we were born in 2 completely different political systems. It's stories like these, stories like mine, which made me realize that my fight for democracy was personal. While I get an education at Harvard, students like Marai have their choices constrained in ways I never even considered possible. While I get to speak my mind, they must calculate every word. While I get to challenge authority and voice my disagreements at the ballot box, they are told what is possible. And that's what keeps me up at night sometimes. The fact that just 90 miles from my home state of Florida, millions of people are suffering because of a ruthless, authoritarian regime. And so it's those stories that made me realize I had to do something. At 12 years old, I wrote my first piece of legislation, an ordinance protecting local schools from nearby construction zones. At 13, I wrote another, this time an ordinance incentivizing the use of permeable pavers to decrease flooding. I wasn't supposed to be in those rooms. I was a middle schooler sitting across from lawyers, engineers, elected officials, people who had been doing this longer than I had been alive. And just like that, one day I stood before the town of Miami Lakes Council as they voted on these ordinances one by one. Yes, yes, yes. Both ordinances passed unanimously. At first, I couldn't believe it, but then I realized something. If a 12-year-old can be involved in the political process, then so could anyone. That mentality led me to start Virtutum Populo. Virtutum Populo is Latin for power to the people. Our mission was simple, to get students involved, not just talking about politics, but understanding it, participating in it, and helping them believe that they too had a role in shaping it. In just 3 years, this small passion project became Miami's largest fully student-run 501c3 nonprofit organization. We raised over $120,000, reached over 4,000 students, but most importantly, we showed students that democracy is not something you watch, but something you do. Eventually, I ran and was elected student advisor to the school board of Miami-Dade County. In this role, I represented the over 340,000 students of America's 3rd largest school district. I visited dozens of schools, met hundreds of students, and through conversation, I learned that students were apathetic not because they didn't care, but because they didn't believe it mattered. And the data backs that up. Last fall, the Harvard Youth Poll found that 64% of young Americans, 64%, believed that our democracy was failing or had already failed. That's not just a statistic, that is a warning. Because democracies don't just disappear from one day to the next, they begin to disappear when people stop believing that they have a role in it. Here's another scary fact. Every republic in the history of the world has eventually collapsed. Roman Republic, Athenian democracy, the Weimar Republic. Now, they didn't collapse overnight, they eroded, slowly, quietly, until one day what was no longer. For most nations, history dictates that we ask not whether they will collapse, but when. it begs a question. How much longer does this republic have left? But America was never meant to be like most nations, because from the very beginning, we were founded on an idea so radical it changed the world. That power does not belong to a king or a party or a ruling class, but that it belongs to the people. I've seen what happens when hope and participation is replaced by silence, and I refuse to let that be the future here. But today, people feel like this notion of self-government, of equality, of the American dream are being tested. And can you really blame them? We've seen unprecedented strains on democratic norms both here and abroad. We've seen political violence that has forced us to confront the very fragility of our own institutions. And so that refusal to let democratic norms slip by here is what brought me to Harvard. Not just to study government, but to understand it and be part of the generation that refuses to let democratic norms slip by past us. My fight for domestic democratic safeguarding and democratic progress abroad is for my family. But it is also for every American child. Because the question is not whether democracy will be tested. It will be. The question is whether we will meet that test. And I believe we will. Because just as I've seen what happens when people are sidelined from the political process, I've also seen what happens when people are invited into democracy instead of pushed away from it. I've seen what happens when a young person finds the power of their voice. I've seen what happens when someone decides, no matter their race, their background, their gender, or their identity, that they too can be part of this great American experiment. Now, folks, America's by no means perfect. We've come a long way, and we still have a long way to go. We should be honest about that. But there's a reason that millions of people from across the world are still willing to give up everything they have for a chance to restart their lives here in these United States. Because I still remember what it felt like 11 years ago to board a flight into a life I didn't yet understand. But I also believe what I have learned since then, that what makes our country great is not the fact that it is perfect. It is the fact that it has given people like me a chance to live the lives that their parents once have hoped for. And so I leave you all with this. Our country was never defined by the words in our founding documents. It was defined by the people willing to give those words meaning in classrooms, in communities, in moments of disagreement, and in acts of participation that often go unseen. And so if my story has taught me one thing, it's not that one person changes everything, but that everything depends on whether people decide to show up at all. Because democracy is not inherited or preserved by default. You either renew it or you lose it. And for me, that means one thing above all: I cannot afford to look away, and neither should any of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Moritz, for that story of realizing the importance of democracy and the fight to maintain it. Sharing their story next is Elizabeth Aguil Tong Mu from the class of 2028 with her speech titled, Expanding Our Circle of Concern.
When people ask me, when I started to work in the humanitarian sector, they expect me to name an organization or a program. But the truth is, I did not start with an organization. It all started with my family. My mother is from the Kakwa tribe, one of the minority tribes in South Sudan, while my father is from the Dinka tribe, the largest ethnic group in South Sudan. Before I understood politics, I was already experiencing how it can sometimes be used for division through my identity and through how I was perceived in the society as a product of intermarriage and where I fit in that society, a country divided along ethnic lines. But when I looked at my parents, I did not see a Kakwa or see a Dinka. I did not see two distinct tribes. I just saw my parents. But what I learned most of all is how diversity can be used to build bridges. And their differences taught me to see things from two different sides. And that helped me in my advocacy. My mother ran a small roadside business while my father worked in the military. He joined the Sudan People's Liberation Army at 15. And when South Sudan attained its independence 21 years later, he continued to work for the government. They both did whatsoever the society expected of responsible adults to keep everything intact. But in South Sudan, I have realized that hard work has not always translated into food security or financial stability. Many hardworking and law-abiding citizens and parents like mine work so hard just to place food on the table. Because salaries were delayed for more than 6 months, and the government failed its civil servants. And that gap showed up when kids are sent home because their school fees are not paid in time. That gap showed up when a uniform must be worn until it's torn. That gap showed up when families have to make impossible choices on which child continues their education and which child doesn't. And too often, it is the girl child who is forced to leave school. It is the girl child who is forced into child marriage, and it is the girl child whose future is exchanged to close the economic gap. Before the start of the Civil War in 2013, UNICEF reported that 52% of girls in South Sudan are married under the age of 18. And if we do the math, we know that during and after wars, everything gets very, very bad. And in 2017, a girl in my class, full of potential and promise, in a last year of primary school, was forced into child marriage by her parents. That incident removed the illusion of distance for me. The distance that allows us to assume that it's okay when bad things happen far, far away. Because this time, child marriage was no longer happening outside there. It was happening inside here to someone like me. She was my friend with dreams of becoming a doctor. She was a child whose body, whose mind and age was not ready for the responsibilities of marriage, let alone a forced one. So, the next year when I joined my secondary school, I made a promise to myself that I will try whatsoever I can to engage parents, to engage teachers, to engage community leaders and policymakers, that this phenomenon does not happen to anyone in my cycle. So with funding from Save the Children in collaboration with Child Right Coalition, one of the organizations in South Sudan, we founded the Child Right Club, first of its kind, children's club that fought for the rights of children across the country. We started a pilot program in 5 schools and extended the debate with support from Crown the Woman, one of the first female organizations in South Sudan, to reach every secondary school to discuss on the grave violations that children faced in South Sudan. And later, Save the Children, in collaboration with Thyroid Collusion, secured us a 2-hour radio slot in one of the UN-run radio called Radio Miriah. And through the children's variety show that we started, we reached community leaders, we talked to parents, to policymakers on how we could prevent child marriage in South Sudan. Soon enough, I found myself in rooms that I could not imagine, calling for the ratification of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, an instrument that could protect the children from any kind of violation. That year, in September, and in October 11th, the International Day of the Girl Child, I took over the office of the country director of Save the Children for a single day. That role allowed me to see what humanitarian efforts can do to give children a new life. I was privileged enough to inform the organization's national strategic plan on how we can expand advocacy on protecting children from any kind of violation. And instead of letting children sing songs or sing poems or recite poems or smile to visitors, we said children should sit on the table of any kind of programs, any kind of project, because children mattered. Because there's nothing for the children without the children. And I believe that children are the greatest investment of each and every country, and if we do not invest in them, we will not have any future to protect. So from my childhood to my advocacy and to my professional life, one thing has always remained constant: that children suffer the consequences of adults' decisions when they are almost never in the room when those decisions are made. Children do not start wars. Children do not design failing systems. And when things go wrong, it is the children who had to live with all these consequences completely. For me, it showed in the South Sudan Second Civil War in 2016. In the second day of the war, when we were warned to leave everything, leave our home, because that place has become a target. So what can one pack in 30 minutes? In my childish mind, I packed my report cards, my Bible, and my favorite church dress. Before my mom was done with packing, we had bombings everywhere and gunshots everywhere like rain. We ran into the streets. Worst of all is that when you are in the street during the day and gunshots are coming through, you will never see them. You can only hear them and notice when someone is shot, falls on the ground, never makes a sound, never moves, and never gets back up. To me, dying was manageable. But seeing my family, my sisters, and my baby brother go through the same things that were happening to people on that street was unbearable. And today, there are children in places like Sudan, Yemen, Lebanon, Gaza, who are suffering the consequences of wars they did not start. If I were to leave you with a single question today, it would be this: would you make the same decision if it were your child who had to live with it? Would you start wars and bomb neighborhoods? It was your loved ones who had to die first. How will our world look like today if every president, every policymaker, every teacher, and everyone make even the tiniest of decision from that standpoint? I am here because somewhere, someone I will never meet decided to expand their cycle of concern so that I can be able to stand here. By the financial aid that I received to be able to go to Harvard, through every donations that were donated to our school library when I was in secondary school, through every sanitary part that allowed me to be in school, through small gifts that are small enough to fit in a box, but big enough to allow a child to start a new life. Because of their generosity, these donors give refugees new life. These donors change lives of a lot of people around the world. And because they expanded their cycle of concern, they have enabled a child like me who knows how wars, poverty, and luck can break a child's spirit have a shot at a place like Harvard. To those people helping children, changing the lives of people, giving every donation, giving families a new life, you are their real Wonder Woman. You are their Woman King. You are their Captain America. You are their real superheroes. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing your story of activism for one of the most vulnerable groups, children. Now, we would love to welcome Risha Sinha from the class of 2029 to share her story titled In the Defense of the Rom-Com and Other Politically Radical Ideas.
Hi guys, there's some tough acts to follow, but I'm here to talk about rom-coms. Critics have generally attacked them for their overplayed plot lines and general cheesiness. And they hail the genre's cliches as overplayed and predictable. But that's where I see the beauty. To kick off any good rom-com, the protagonist generally undergoes a transformation, an inciting event that teaches us that real beauty lies within. Generally, this involves a girl straightening her hair, taking off her glasses, and shocking the world. Now, I'm quite attached to my glasses, so this transformation looked a little different for me. I present to you cliché 1, the makeover. I noticed a splotch of white creeping in from the left of my kneecap in 4th grade. After a few years of doctor's appointments, I got a diagnosis: vitiligo, an incurable, hypervisible autoimmune skin disease. Now, with that vitiligo crept in a chronic shame, one that I remedied with countless cover-ups and procedures until one sweltering summer day, the imminent danger of heat stroke overrode my embarrassment at the sight of my multicolored leg, and I wore my first pair of shorts in 5 years. Now, in a rom-com following the makeover, the protagonist generally reconciles with the change to their life through grand gestures to people they hardly know. After the event that I like to call the shot short heard around the world, I wrote articles in my high school's newspaper entreating readers to #LoveThemselves, and I joined a support group for others afflicted with the disease. This was cliché 2, the connection. And I had become vitiligo's veritable poster child. Now, that support group also had an advocacy branch that lobbied the state legislature for increased resources for those afflicted. I joined that, too. Cliché 3 in a rom-com is genre-defining. The meet-cute. Call it serendipity or just clever screenwriting, but I fell for politics. During one lobbying day at the Massachusetts State House, I met my state legislator, a legislative champion on Beacon Hill. During the event, I watched as my fellow advocates told stories of their battles with mental health and self-image, and about their struggles to receive healthcare coverage and medical support. I watched as the representatives listened. Some you could tell were only there as a courtesy, but others truly empathized with their constituents. What I realized was that each person in that room, just by virtue of their interaction with each other, held the power to change the lives of countless others outside those four walls. And just like that, I was head over heels. That summer, I applied to work in my state representative's office, and when she announced her retirement the following year, I joined a campaign for her seat. Cue cliché 4, the montage, a series of events designed to show strength through difficulty and inspire. Think Rocky Balboa training, but without a sweaty Sylvester Stallone. Working for the campaign in a Democratic primary, in a three-way Democratic primary with a small team, meant putting the pedal to the metal. It was a blur of late-night strategy meetings and long days, going to coffees hosted at residents' homes. I took pictures of our candidate shaking hands with nearly every person at nearly every city event. I designed a website and newsletters and mailers and door hangers. But most of all, I knocked on doors. I talked to person after person, hour after hour, my cheeks sore from smiling, asking questions, trying to persuade, talking about zoning and schools and why the T is always late and why we can't find parking. My glasses rattling from getting the door slammed in my face over and over and over until finally, on September 3rd, at around 10 p.m., after the hardest 3 months of my life, running on a couple hours of sleep, a few protein bars, and a dream, or it might have been red Gatorade, we won our election. Nothing compares to the joy of that moment. But the following day, with the election suddenly over, I was devastated. Forget entering the first day of my senior year with the jubilation of a winner. I walked to school choking back hiccupy sobs and snot. It was not pretty. It turns out, the often forgotten thing about pouring everything you've got into something is that when it's over, you've got nothing left. How could I ever move on? This was cliché 5, the complete and utter meltdown. Luckily, rom-coms have a response. As When Harry Met Sally puts it, when you realize you want to spend the rest of your life with somebody, you want to start the rest of your life as soon as possible. Now, in one way or another, I want to spend the rest of my life with politics, that often disdained field of power, corruption, and dysfunction, and that terrifies me. But in this terror, I find comfort in the rom-com's endless capacity to hope. See, rom-coms aren't just about inordinately attractive people falling in love. Rom-coms are about constancy. In a rom-com, happy endings are guaranteed. In politics, happy endings are matters of justice and peace, of life and death. We scorn rom-coms for the simplicity of their message, but consider for a moment the message itself. Place love above all else, even when, especially when, it feels impossible. Imagine what could be if our politics did the same. And don't get me wrong, my story is really nothing special. Compared to my peers, I've endured very little, and I've accomplished even less. But what my relationship with politics has taught me, as cliche as it may be, it's taught me how to love. How to love myself, how to love my neighbors, how to love the possibility of a future that's greater than today. Now, I may not know where my relationship with politics will take me, but I do know this. The greatest rom-coms end with cliché 6, the run through an airport. Now, I may not have run through an airport yet, but I have run between doors minutes before polls close to get every last vote out. And if that's not true love, what is? To completely misquote Julia Roberts in Notting Hill, at the end of the day, I'm just a girl standing in front of the world, asking it to love more. Thank you.
Thank you, Risha, for that story of self-acceptance and the importance of compassion. We now welcome our final speaker, Dylan Shotko, from the class of 2029, to share his speech titled, From the Eighth Stair to the State Capitol, Abuse and Advocacy.
13 steps, each about 12 inches high, 33 wide, covered in a long, outdated beige carpet. This might sound like your ordinary set of household stairs, but for my young self, it was my personal purgatory. My most common seat as a child was the 8th step, positioned perfectly high enough to conceal myself from my father, but low enough to still peer out from behind the wall to my mother. As shouts echoed and glass shattered, I couldn't help but stare at my tear-filled reflection in the mirror that hung at the top of the stairs. In those moments, I had nobody. No siblings to cling to, no friends, no family to console me. I felt helpless. As much as I pleaded, as hard as I tried, I could not control my father. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I didn't know the words abuse, domestic violence. I just knew that my tata was mad again. And for a long time, I sat on those stairs thinking it was normal. I thought most kids slept with a pair of scissors under their pillow just in case. I thought most mothers had a to-go bag packed at all times. So much of my childhood was spent garnering the courage to leave that 8th stair. Now, in theory, it wasn't hard. Every day, I ran down the whole staircase on my way to school, to ride my bike, to build Minecraft worlds with my neighbors. Yet my father's rage paralyzed me. Every time his booming voice rang out, I would try to calm him down, only to be banished once more to that 8th step. Only when silence came was I finally free to step down and comfort my mother. And I remember one of those moments more than most. At the age of maybe 11, I came down and saw the woman I love most sobbing on the floor. I knew in that moment that I could no longer sit quietly. I had to be strong. If not for me, then for her. If nobody was going to protect us, I would. For most people, stepping down signifies defeat. But for me, it represents my strength, my courage, my voice. For years of my life, I considered progress to be going down my stairs. First through abuse, then my parents' divorce, and finally, through healing. Junior year of high school, as I knotted my red tie in the same mirror at the top of the stairs, I paused. Gazing upon my reflection, my eyes slowly drifted down to that 8th stair behind me. I realized in that moment that I had come so much farther than I or anyone could have ever imagined. That little boy, so scared to step down, was now the man preparing to step into the state capitol. For so long, my anger had nowhere to go. It sat with me on that 8th stair, building with every shout, every slammed door, every night, wishing things were different. But standing under that rotunda, seeing the power of advocacy, I knew that I had found my purpose, and I embraced it. But I wasn't satisfied with just being a legislative intern. I wanted to use my voice. So senior year of high school, I did. I sat down with my representative and I convinced her to introduce my bill proposal. Months passed and we ironed out the details together, but just 2 days before the filing deadline, she dropped my bill. I was devastated, but determined, I quickly found another representative to introduce the bill. But the problem was, this late in the process, we needed text for the bill, which had never been drafted by Capitol staff. So I wrote it. Against the advice of the representative and basically her whole staff, I pushed off my schoolwork and stayed up late that night, analyzing statute, trying to piece together how to even write a real bill. And I was just about sure that what I sent in that morning would never, ever work. But a week later, as I opened my front door after school, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Capitol staff, and all it said was HB 3613. I clicked the link, and sure enough, they introduced my bill. Immediately, I dropped my backpack, sat down on the first stair, and I sobbed. And as I turned my head upwards at that 8th stair, I kind of wished I could have told him. I wished I could have told my young self that I just introduced a bill to mandate child abuse prevention education beginning in preschool, so that no kid would ever have to sit on that 8th stair feeling helpless. And I didn't stop there. I realized that my story was not necessarily unique, and neither was that feeling of being helpless. I became passionate about advocating for the most vulnerable because I knew what it felt like to be one of them, to feel like nobody was coming to save us. So that same year, I introduced a bill to protect students' access to sick days. Just 2 months ago, I introduced 2 more bills. One to amend health insurance regulations so that young adults, especially in the LGBTQ community, could receive life-altering, sensitive treatments with complete confidentiality, and another to make Illinois the 2nd state in the nation to create a domestic violence offender registry. Now, none of these bills have passed, at least not yet. But that's not necessarily what matters most to me. Because for the first time, my voice is not confined to the walls of my home. A few weeks ago, I sat in my dorm and I watched as the House Insurance Committee debated my bill. Legislators, advocates from the ACLU, insurance companies, even entire state departments arguing over my words. The work of a boy who never envisioned making it this far is heard and considered in House chambers. And to me, that's a success. I know now that I have a purpose. everything I endured, every step I took was not just for myself. My healing, I've learned, is in what my pain can do for others. Abuse may have scarred me, but if I can use the strength, the courage, the voice that it gave me to help the helpless, then I am proud to wear those scars. So I will continue to step down and fight for that boy and for all those like him. And regardless of how far I go, I will always look back at that 8th stair and remind myself who I'm fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan, for that powerful story of overcoming adversity and self-actualization. As we can all agree, those 6 speeches were incredibly impactful, and we recognize the courage it took all of you to share those extremely intimate stories.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. And let's give one more round of applause for the 6 speakers showcased.